Well, welcome to our Sunday School Hour. This is Graceway Baptist Church, of course, September 7th, 2025. Now, as we make our way through the book of Judges, I've been so much into this, writing this month's lessons and all of that. Boy, it gets a little gloomy sometimes and a little dark. But we always have to remember there's always light at the end of the tunnel. And as the old joke goes, it's not always an oncoming train. In this case, it's the light of the Lord, His promises, His covenant. And we're going to see as we go through, especially this month, the abject unfaithfulness of the nation of Israel in spite of everything God has done for them. And then how God, being an unchanging God, there's sometimes when we find Him being angry and disciplining Israel, but He never wipes them out because He never forgets the covenant that He made to Abraham way back there in Genesis chapter 15. And some people have said before, well, doesn't this mean God changes? Because at one point He's pleased with them, and then He changes to become unpleased with them, or displeased with them, I guess I should say. Um, I think we have to think of it like this. God had laid out the standard. If you obey me, I'll bless you. If you don't, then you're going to face the consequences. And that never changes. That has been the rule all the way back to Adam and Eve, right? And so God doesn't change. He hates sin and He disciplines His children when they fall into sin. And that's really what we find in the book of Judges. And so the dark side of it is what people do. The light at the end of the tunnel is God always delivers, God always rescues them. And we're going to find that in that they didn't always respond properly to that because they would fall back into sin. But God was always gracious, I guess we would say, to rescue them. That's why they had these 6 different judges, these deliverers. And we're going to find out that Israel always responded the same way. Whenever the judges came along, then, yay, God has done something great for us. When the judge died, they reverted back to where they were before. Kind of like pulling on a rubber band. It always kind of goes back to where it was before. So we see the patience and the goodness and the grace of God. So today we're going to be looking at a profile of Israel's failures. We're still kind of in the introduction of the book, and it gives us some principles and some of the story of Israel. And then sometimes it goes backwards to look at something that happened in the past. That's weird for us as Westerners. We look at history and we do it in a straight line. But to the Jews, they didn't always recount their history like that. Chronology was not the important part to them. The important part to them was the important part. We say sometimes the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And that's what we find in the book of Judges. So it repeats and it recycles and circles back on some things to make sure that we understand what is going on. So think about this introduction with a quote from Pastor Chuck Swindoll. We are all faced with a series of great opportunities brilliantly disguised as impossible situations. And that's always been that way. The virgin birth of Christ, oh, that's impossible. No, it was a great opportunity to spotlight who Jesus Christ is. When we think about Israel coming out of Egypt, that's an impossibility. No, it's a great opportunity for God to show His power and His might. Being in the wilderness and surviving that many people with all of their herds and their flocks, that's impossible. How do you water all of them? And then we find out that God said, strike the rock, and there was a river gushing out of that rock. Not a trickle, a river, Psalm 106 says, or 105 maybe. And so when we think about that, we see the impossible things that bring great opportunities. Well, the problem, though, is that Israel, like us, they couldn't seem to get this right. And they saw everything in the negative, and they based it upon their wisdom and their ability instead of God's faithfulness. And so why did they do that? That's what we're going to try to answer by looking at the scripture. So the first point that we want to see is that pride. It always goes before a fall, or in this case, we need to put an S on it, before their falls, because they did it over and over and over. It always seems like no matter what God said, no matter what he commanded, Israel always had a better idea. And there was, well, we can't do that. And sometimes it was, we don't want to do that. We would rather do things our way. Now, I remind you, in the book of Proverbs, it says there's a way that seems right to man. It always is that way. It seems better. It seems good. It seems like it is pragmatic. It'll work. But the end thereof are the ways of death. And we find this happening over and over with Israel. And it says in verse 27 and 28, to go with point one, however, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean, its villages, or Tanash, its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo. That's actually a modern day place. We can still find that. That's called Armageddon, might sound familiar to you, and its villages. Now, why didn't they do that? For the Canaanites were determined to dwell in the land, and of course they were. And it came to pass, now we're going to emphasize this, when Israel was strong, that they put the Canaanites under tribute. We'll talk about that, but did not completely drive them out. Okay? Now, that last part of it says that they put them under tribute and did not drive them out. Why? Because Israel thought they had a better idea. Why don't we just take these people, and the word tribute there can refer to a tax, and most likely does. Maybe put the Canaanites to work, and then take whatever they produce as your own and make some money off of them. So the idea is economic, as well as maybe the crop would be better because the Canaanites would be farming the land and there's more workers and more irrigation, more whatever. Maybe they're manufacturing. We don't know exactly, but we do know they're also being taxed. So Israel thought, well, why do we want to wipe these people out and get rid of all of this? Because we can always use the money. But the sad thing is, 6 more tribes failed to be obedient in the same way as Judah and Benjamin. We read about that last time. We've got Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, and the tribe of Dan. These 6 tribes, 6 more, become unfaithful. This is like the old saying, same song, second verse, could get better, but it's going to get worse, and it does. And they thought that they could, got it in quotes here, they could manage the Canaanite situation. We're big enough, and you notice when we read in those verses, when Israel was strong. Now, when they got strong, they thought they could handle it. They thought that we don't have to do what God says. We can take care of it our way because we're strong, we're powerful, we're victorious, we've got resources. And that always worked until it didn't work, right? And that's exactly what happened here. So for a time, they benefited by leaving the Canaanites in the land. Why would we want to get rid of them? They're, to quote one of our former presidents, they're doing the jobs that we don't want to do. And we can force them to do that because it was a form of slavery. Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12 says, therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And that's what happened when Israel was doing well because of the blessing of God. They got arrogant and they got prideful and they thought they could manage it. They thought they could handle it, and they thought everything would be great. Again, it worked for a while, and that's what tricked them and trapped them into this whole thing. The number 2 point that we have here, or point number 2, is perceived economic benefit in verses 29 through 33. Now, doesn't this always come down to the bottom line, economics? If we can afford it, we'll do it. If we can't afford it, we won't. If it benefits us financially, we'll do just about anything. And we will also abandon even things that we know better than to abandon, just like Israel did here. They knew they should do things God's way, but there was money to be made the other way. So why would we want to obey God if it's going to cost us? Well, you remember the old saying that sin will always cost you more than you ever intended to pay. It'll keep you longer than you ever intended to stay. And there was a third part that I can't remember, but you get the point. And this is what is happening here. They would weigh it all out. There was a time when my little brother came home from school, got off of the bus, and he was so mad at a little girl that lived next door. My brother was pretty young at this time. And he came in, he was a hothead, and he was so mad at that girl, he wanted to go over and he said, I just want to punch her face. And my mom says, well, Jeff, we don't do that. You don't hit girls like that. And he said, I am. And she said, well, you know what'll happen? He said, I don't care as long as I can bust her face one time. And then she said, well, you know what your dad will say about that? And he said, you don't understand. I don't care. It'll be worth it. Whatever you do to me, it'll be worth it if I can just smash her face one time. Well, he didn't, but I remember watching him and going, you are so dumb. You don't tell them what you're going to do, and you don't just outright defy them. You do what I always do, fly under the radar. But Israel is kind of like my little brother in this situation. As long as they thought it was worth it, they would weigh everything out. Okay, there'll be consequences if we disobey God, but we'll make money, and they would rather have the money than they would have the pleasure of God. How many other times have you read about something like that in the scripture? They love the praise of men rather than the praise of God and things like that. Well, that's kind of what we have happening here. Perceived economic benefit. Look at verse 29. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer. So the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. Nor did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Naalal. So the Canaanites dwelt among them. You getting a theme here? They didn't do it, and then they put up with the Canaanites, and God had told them to drive them all out, but they didn't. And so they would put them under tribute. Again, think about what that means. Nor did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or Ahab, Akzib, other names that are very difficult to pronounce. You can work on those all you want to, because we don't really know where they are anyway. But go on down to verse 32. And so the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Again, that is written in there to emphasize the fact that they were completely disobedient to the plan of God and the commandments of God in this situation. So, nor did they drive them out, nor did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Bethshemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, and they dwelt among the Canaanites. Same thing, again, the inhabitants of the land, and nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath were put under tribute to them. In other words, I think about when Joseph goes to check on his brothers at Dothan. Remember that? And they go, oh, here comes that dreamer. And they really wanted to kill him because they put him in a pit and they were just going to leave him there. And then somebody says, wait a minute, here's some Midianite traders. We could sell him and we could make some money. Why let him die for nothing when we can make money off of him? And this is what Israel, the entire nation, all of these tribes are doing with the Canaanites. Well, why drive them out? We could make some money. We could have benefit from them. And again, it kind of overlaps with point number one a little bit, but under tribute refers to taxation and also, in this case, forced labor. There was a little paragraph in the ESV Study Bible that I thought illustrates this. The effects were tragic. The Israelites turned to the Baals, false gods, idols, and the gods of those Canaanites who remained among them and forsook the Lord. Thus, Israel's worship did not remain pure. Well, of course it didn't. They were deluded, they were disobedient. And so, as they tried to do things their own way, they were doing what, as we referenced earlier, seemed right to man, but brought the ways of death. This is going to sow the seeds of destruction in their life. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, you remember it says, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one or love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the others. You cannot serve God and money." And yet they thought they could. They thought they could. I had a friend that sat down with somebody to try to work out his financial problems. He was in bad financial shape. And so he was working with this other man, and they were working on a budget. And as they were doing all of the addition and subtraction and all of that, the man helping my friend said, "You're not going to be able to play golf every week like you have before." And he goes, "Oh no, I'm going to do that." And he said, "Look, brother, it doesn't add up. You don't have enough money to do that." And he just looked and said, "No, I'm not giving that up. I believe I can." Now, when I look at that, I go, well, that's a dumb thing to do. And this is what the people of God were doing. They were weighing everything out, and they didn't see the deficits. They didn't see that they couldn't afford to disobey God. And so they just thought, we'll make it work, and we'll do something somehow. We'll worry about it later on. And Jesus was exactly right describing the situation in his day, but that also fit the situation of the judges. We've got these people working for us. They're doing the jobs we don't want to do. They're making money for us. They're paying taxes. Why would we want to get rid of them? And as you find out, you can't serve God and mammon. And that's exactly the way God took it. That brings us to point number 3. Okay? We look at verses 34 and 35. And it says, "And the Amorites forced the children of Dan," Dan is an Israeli tribe, Amorites or Canaanites, "forced the tribe of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down into the valley." And the Amorites were determined, you might want to underline that word, determined to dwell in Mount Heres and Ajalon and in the Shaabim. And when the strength of the house of Joseph became greater, they were put under tribute. So what are we finding here? Point number 3 is the persistence of the enemy. What did they expect? And I wonder sometimes, what do we expect? We get tempted, we get under a little bit of pressure, we back down. What do we think? The devil's going to make a treaty with us, or he's going to back off? One of the things you learn from reading your Bible is the devil and his demons, they love to kick you when you're down. And so when the tribe of Dan here can't defeat the Amorites, do they think the Amorites are going to say, okay, you go your way and we'll go our way? No. It's kind of that peace through strength thing. The Amorites went after the tribe of Dan because they knew they could. And they knew that Dan couldn't do anything back for them. And I would like to ask the leaders of that, well, what did you expect? Did you expect that the Amorites are going to go, okay, we surrender, uncle, wave the white flag and give them anything? No, not without a fight. And when they're winning the fight, do you expect them to go, well, we won, so we're going to give you this land? No, they're going to occupy the land. And it's as if the resistance of the enemy caught Israel completely off guard. What did they think that was going to be? A cakewalk? What did they think was going to happen? Just because they show up, the Amorites are going to go on the run? No, actually what happened is they underestimated the fight that was in the enemy. Now, if you compare yourself to the enemy, you're always going to be inferior. But when you compare your enemy to God, you find out that God is always greater. And that's what they failed to do. Just like in the wilderness when they spied out the land, oh, they're too big, oh, they're too strong, oh, there's no way we could defeat them. And it sounds like the tribe of Dan just kind of said, this is harder than we thought. We're going to give up. We didn't sign up for this, in other words. And so they retreated. And the Ammonites kept them in the mountains. And we look at mountain property now as very expensive and where rich people live, and it's very beautiful. But if you think of it from an agrarian society, what crops do you grow in the mountains? With all due respect to Mrs. Olson and Folger's coffee, which is supposed to be mountain grown, not much. Not much. In fact, for many, many years, people that lived in the mountains were significantly poorer than people who lived elsewhere. Think of Appalachia and places of the Ozarks and places like that. And that's what was happening here. The tribe of Dan, how are they going to graze sheep in the mountains? How are they going to raise crops in the mountains? They wanted the fertile plains to be in. And the Amorites said, nope, this is what we're going to take care of, and this is where we're going to live. And so Dan had to give it all up. In fact, later on, Dan moved, and they moved way up north. It was interesting when we were in Israel, there was one day that we took a trip up to the mouth of the Jordan River, and where it all started from the snowfall from Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon still had snow on it, and the melting of that snow all throughout the year was what fed the Jordan River. And they told us there was a city there that the tribe of Dan inhabited. It wasn't their allotted land under Joshua. It was land that they were forced to take because they couldn't conquer these people that we just now read about in these verses. Even though God had promised, and even though that was the will and the plan of God, Dan wasn't interested. Dan wanted to go somewhere else where they may not have to fight. Now, the bad thing is that when you go up to the city that they inhabited, one of the things, and we saw some of the relics of these things, idolatry was rampant up there. And that didn't do Dan any good because they kind of assimilated into that culture instead of being the conquerors that they were supposed to be in their own land. And what did it boil down to? It says in verse 35, and the Amorites, were determined to dwell in Mount Horez. And they wanted all of it. And Dan wasn't ready for that. Have you ever caught yourself in a situation where you're tempted and you think, well, I'll just, stand strong, put on my armor, and then it seemed like the battle lasted longer than you thought it was going to. Maybe it was more costly than you thought it was going to be. And maybe you found out that the enemy wanted victory more than you did. Well, that's a sure sign of defeat, and that's exactly what was going on here. Really? They're going to fight, and they're going to fight for a long time, and so they're pushed back into the hills, and then they migrate to the north of Israel. They never inhabited the land allotted to them. They never knew that victory, and they apparently did not trust the power of God, or they would have persisted. And so many times we think about in Ephesians chapter 6, Paul said we're to put on the whole armor of God, that having done all, we may stand. And you know where our problem is? We're not willing to do all. We're not willing to keep fighting. We're not willing to press on. We're not willing to pay the price in all of it. And so we never see the victory. We want instant gratification. Peter put it like this in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8 and 9. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. But we tend to think, oh, it's too much, it's too hard, it's too long. I'm the only one that's fighting. Everybody else is having a wonderful life. and look at me and look how hard it is. Peter says, quit whining and understand your enemy is not I started to say pansy, but that's not politically correct. Your enemy doesn't give up. Your enemy is not weak. Your enemy is strong and intimidating, but greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. And so many times we just quit way too soon. And then the fourth point is going to be this: the bottom line, they did not believe God. Now, that's really it. Because in verse 36 it says, now the boundary of the Amorites was from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. Now, what in the world could be the point of that? If you have an enemy that is supposed to be conquered and driven out of the land, if that had happened, then the Amorites would not have a boundary. Nations have boundaries. Kingdoms have boundaries. Cities and municipalities have boundaries. States have boundaries. There is no, let's think, what could we compare that to? Well, there is no place where we would say the boundary of the land of the Philistines is this, because there is no land of the Philistines now. They've been gone for a long, long, long time, right? But in this time, in the book of Judges, the Amorites have a boundary. Why? Because they had land. They had places that they had conquered. They had places that they were dwelling, even though God had commanded them to drive them out. And so the bottom line on that is, why did the Amorites have a boundary? It's because Israel allowed people who were devoted to their destruction to dwell among them. Now, when you think about that from a practical standpoint, the Canaanites were not just saying, hey, you get along with us and we'll get along with you and we'll work together, and, can't we all just get along and we can just have peace and it'll be wonderful. The Canaanites wanted to get rid of the Israelis even more than the Israelis wanted to get rid of the Canaanites, obviously, because the Israelis put up with the Canaanites, but the Canaanites, in every situation when they had the chance, they either killed or enslaved Israel. And so why wasn't Israel, the people of God with the covenant and the promise, why were they not successful in all of this? Well, it wasn't because God had failed, and it wasn't because of anything like that. But Israel, they just were not interested, and they thought they had a better idea, as we've seen in previous points, and they just didn't really believe God could do that. And so they were skeptical about the covenant that had been made with Abraham. What does that have to do with us? That's a very old, ancient covenant by this point. They weren't sure God was going to be faithful, and that was the real problem. They leaned on short-term fixes, and that led to generations of problems. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 6, it says very clearly, but without faith, it is impossible, underline that word, impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Well, Israel didn't believe any of that. And so they weren't sure that the Canaanite gods were, maybe more powerful. And so, they just kind of gave in, and they abandoned the God of their fathers. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 22, Samuel said, has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the Lord? Behold, now listen to this, to obey is better than sacrifice, or offering a sacrifice, and to heed or hearken or to listen or to pay attention than the fat of rams. Well, that was not only King Saul's problem with the Amalekites, but that was Israel's problem going way back into the book of Judges, hundreds of years before Saul. They just didn't believe God. It was the same thing that happened to Israel in the wilderness in that first generation that didn't get to go into the promised land. They just didn't believe God. So if that's true, then what lesson do we learn from that? We need to learn to believe God, and our belief should drive us to obedience to God. No matter what our circumstances, no matter what our flesh is telling us, no matter what the culture might say, we are going to obey the Lord, and we're going to obey Him all the time in every situation. So we conclude by saying this: you can see that not much has changed. Believers today allow the enemy to gain control of our lives and in our families, even in our churches, through pride. We think we can do it better on our own. Through money, we can make some money off of this. This is more profitable. Through resistance, the enemy knows if they just hang in there, we'll give up and we'll quit eventually. They just have to outlast us. And through unbelief. So many people don't believe God. They don't believe the gospel. They don't believe the word of God. And they think that they have to make it on their own. So may God grant that we might learn from this warning and we might be different, and that we might humble ourselves before the Lord, that we might realize we're but stewards. Everything we have belongs to God, even our very life. May we also learn, too, that the enemy may be fierce, and the enemy may be like that roaring lion. But we also know this: our God has already won the victory, and all we have to do is be diligent and persevere, and we will win the victory. And may we just choose to believe God and to believe His word, no matter what our feelings or emotions or anyone else may be telling us, and live for the glory of God. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it very much, and pray that as you study this and present it to your class, that the Lord might speak through His word to us, giving us that warning, and that we might not make the same mistakes that they made back in these ancient times. Thank you again for your time. May the Lord bless you. I'll be praying for you as you present this lesson.